The world knew Cowboys from Hell as the album that changed metal forever. But nobody knew about the night Dimebag Darrell walked out of Pantera Sound Studios and told producer Terry Date he was done. Not done with the session. Done with Pantera. Done with everything. What happened in those 48 hours between his departure and his return would shape not just an album, but an entire generation of metal music. And Terry Date kept every second of it recorded on tape, locked in a vault for 3 decades. Because what transpired in that studio wasn't just about making music. It was about survival, brotherhood, and the moment when Dimebag Darrell had to choose between his vision and his sanity. Before we dive deeper into this untold story, if you appreciate these deep explorations into the legends who shaped metal history, hit that subscribe button. We bring you the stories that never made it to the official biographies, the moments that defined careers, and the truths that only emerge when time allows the dust to settle. Now let's step back into that sweltering Texas studio in July 1990, where the temperature wasn't just rising from the weather outside. Pantera Sound Studios sat in a nondescript building in Arlington, Texas, 15 minutes from where the Abbott brothers grew up. Terry Date arrived in late June 1990 with a reputation forged through his work with Soundgarden and Mother Love Bone, but he'd never encountered an environment quite like what Pantera was about to create. The band had just signed with Atco Records, their first major label deal, and everything was riding on this album. Their previous 4 albums, released independently, had shown glimpses of potential, but were still rooted in the glam metal aesthetic they were desperately trying to shed. This album, Cowboys from Hell, would either launch them into the stratosphere or confirm that their window of opportunity had closed. Dimebag, still calling himself Diamond Darrell in those days, arrived at the first session with 3 Dean ML guitars, a rack of effects that looked like mission control, and a vision so specific that he'd drawn diagrams of every tone he wanted to achieve. His brother Vinnie Paul had already been tracking drums for 2 weeks, laying down the thunderous double bass patterns that would become the album's backbone. Rex Brown's bass tracks were scheduled to follow Dimebag's guitar work, and then there was Phil Anselmo, the wild-eyed vocalist from New Orleans, who'd joined the band just 2 years earlier and had transformed their entire trajectory. Phil was living in a tiny apartment near the studio, spending his nights screaming along to Ex-Hoarder and Exodus records, preparing his voice for what he kept calling the most violent vocal performance anyone's ever recorded. Terry Date's production notes from those first sessions, recently discovered in his personal archive, reveal a meticulous attention to detail that bordered on obsession. Darrell refused to use any amplifier settings he'd used before. He'd brought in this Randall RG100 and a solid-state power amp, running it through a technique he called scooped mids that shouldn't work on paper, but sounds like a buzzsaw cutting through concrete. What Date didn't write in those early notes, but would later confess in the hidden recordings, was his concern that Dimebag's perfectionism might derail the entire project before it truly began. By the 3rd week of July, they'd completed basic tracking for 5 songs: Cowboys from Hell, Primal Concrete Sledge, Psycho Holiday, Medicine Man, and Heresy. Each track had required between 30 and 70 guitar takes from Dimebag, not because he was making mistakes, but because he could hear microscopic differences in tone and attack that no one else in the room could perceive. Vinnie Paul, who'd known his brother's perfectionist tendencies since they were children competing in talent shows across Texas, tried to mediate between Dimebag's vision and the studio's budget constraints. Atco Records had allocated $45,000 for the entire album production, a modest sum even by 1990 standards, and at their current pace they'd burn through it before completing half the record. The tension that had been building found its first real flashpoint during the tracking of Cemetery Gates. Dimebag had composed this 8-minute epic as a showcase for both his melodic sensibility and his technical prowess, featuring a guitar solo that would require 3 separate sections recorded at different times and spliced together. But Phil Anselmo had different ideas about the song's vocal arrangement. According to Terry Date's notes from July 23rd, Phil wanted to sing the opening verse in a clean tone, almost crooning, while Darrell believed this undermined the song's aggression. They'd been arguing for 2 hours while Rex and Vinny had left the control room. What the official notes don't capture, but what exists on Terry Date's personal recordings, is the full scope of that argument. Phil insisted that dynamic range, moving from melodic singing to aggressive screaming, would make the song more impactful. Dimebag countered that they were making a metal album, not a power ballad collection, and that any hint of their glam metal past would sabotage their credibility. "We buried Dimebag Darrell," Dimebag said on that recording, his voice strained with frustration. "We buried that whole fucking era. If we start singing pretty again, everyone's gonna think this is just Glam Slam Part 5. Phil's response was equally pointed. "If we just scream for 45 minutes, we're Slayer clones. We gotta show we can do something they can't." Terry Date, caught between 2 immovable forces, made a decision that would prove crucial. He suggested they record it both ways, use the studio's downtime to create 2 complete versions, and then decide which one served the album better. It was a diplomatic solution that cost extra time and money, but it diffused the immediate crisis. What Date couldn't have known was that this compromise established a dangerous precedent, one that would nearly destroy the entire project within a week. July 29th, 1990. Terry Date's personal recording from that day begins with ambient studio noise, the hum of amplifiers, the distant sound of Vinnie Paul adjusting his drum kit in the tracking room. Then Dimebag's voice, calm but firm. "I need to do that solo again." This was take 47 of the Cemetery Gates guitar solo, a performance that everyone in the control room agreed was flawless. But Dimebag heard something in the vibrato during the final sustained note, a microscopic inconsistency that he couldn't let stand. Terry Date's response, captured clearly on the tape. "Darrell, it's perfect. I've been doing this for 10 years. That take is perfect." And then Dimebag's reply, the one that would change everything. "Then you don't understand what we're trying to do here." The control room went silent. Rex Brown, who'd been sitting on the couch reviewing bass charts, looked up. Vinnie Paul, standing behind Terry Date at the mixing console, put his hand on his brother's shoulder. But Dimebag shrugged it off, unplugged his guitar, and walked toward the door. "I need some air," he said. And then he left. Not just the control room, not just the building, but the entire project. According to Terry Date's notes, supplemented by his secret recordings, Dimebag Darrell didn't return any phone calls for 48 hours. What happened during those 2 days has never been fully documented, but pieces of the story exist in fragments. Rita Haney, Dimebag's girlfriend at the time, later mentioned in a radio interview that Darrell spent the first night sitting in his home studio, playing guitar unplugged, not speaking to anyone. Vinnie Paul drove to the house 3 times, but Darrell wouldn't answer the door. Phil Anselmo, in a moment of surprising vulnerability, left a voicemail that Terry Date later transcribed in his notes. "Brother, I don't care if we're singing or screaming or fucking yodeling. This album doesn't exist without your guitar. Come back." But it wasn't any of those gestures that brought Dimebag back to Pantego Sound Studios. It was something else entirely. Something Terry Date recorded when Darrell finally returned on July 31st. When Dimebag walked back into the studio on that Tuesday afternoon, he was carrying a cassette tape. Not a demo, not a reference recording, but something he'd made in his home studio during those 48 hours of isolation. He handed it to Terry Date without saying a word, and Date, sensing the gravity of the moment, put it into the deck and pressed play. What came through the speakers was Domination, a song that hadn't been on the original album schedule, performed entirely by Dimebag on guitar, bass, drums programmed on his home setup, and even a rough vocal melody he'd hummed into the microphone. The song was crushing, relentless, and unlike anything else they'd tracked. But more importantly, it was complete. Dimebag had written, arranged, and performed an entire song in 2 days, channeling his frustration into creation rather than destruction. Terry Date's recording from that moment captures his genuine astonishment. "Where did this come from?" he asked. And Dimebag's answer, delivered with the exhaustion of someone who hadn't slept properly in weeks. "This is what happens when you stop arguing and just fucking create." The room stayed silent for another moment, and then Phil Anselmo spoke up. "We're recording this, right now, exactly as you wrote it." It was a complete surrender of ego from a vocalist known for his unwillingness to compromise, and it marked the turning point of the entire Cowboys from Hell sessions. But here's what Terry Date's hidden recordings reveal that has never been made public. Before they started, tracking Domination. Dimebag pulled Terry aside in the hallway outside the control room. The recording is muffled, but Dimebag's words are clear enough. "I almost didn't come back. I was this close to calling my dad and telling him I was done with the band. Not just the album, the band." Terry Date asked him what changed his mind, and Dimebag's answer cuts to the core of why Cowboys from Hell became what it became. "I realized that if I walked away, I'd spend the rest of my life wondering what we could have made. And I can't live with that kind of wondering." What happened after Dimebag's return transformed not just the Cowboys from Hell sessions, but Terry Date's entire approach to producing aggressive music. In his private notes, Date describes implementing what he called the isolation method. Whenever a creative disagreement arose, instead of forcing compromise or choosing sides, he would give each band member access to the studio during off hours to record their vision of how a song should sound. Dimebag would track his guitar parts his way. Phil would record vocals his way. Rex would lay down bass lines following his instincts. Then they'd convene as a group, listen to all the versions, and collectively decide which approach served the song best. This method yielded surprising results. The guitar tone on Cowboys from Hell that became Dimebag's signature sound, that scooped mid-aggression that influenced a generation of metal guitarists, emerged from one of these isolated sessions. Dimebag had stayed at the studio until 4 in the morning, experimenting with microphone placement, amplifier settings, and even the room's acoustics, moving his cabinet around the tracking space until he found the spot where the concrete walls created just the right amount of natural reverb. Terry Date's recording from that night captures Dimebag talking to himself, working through the problem. "It needs to cut, but it can't be shrill. It needs to be heavy, but it can't be muddy. It's gotta sit in the mix like a fucking knife." When the rest of the band heard the tone the next day, there was no debate. That was the sound of the album. Similarly, Phil Anselmo's vocal approach on Cemetery Gates, the very song that had caused the initial conflict, came from one of these isolated sessions. Phil had arrived at the studio at midnight, when no one else was there except Terry Date, and recorded the opening verse with that clean, almost crooning delivery he'd originally proposed. But then, without anyone telling him to, he'd recorded alternate takes where he started aggressive and stayed aggressive. When the band listened to both versions in the morning, it was Dimebag who surprised everyone. "The clean opening works," he said. "It makes the scream hit harder. We were wrong to fight it." That admission, that willingness to acknowledge that his initial instinct had been incorrect, appears throughout Terry Date's private notes as the moment when Dimebag fully embraced collaboration over control. But Terry Date's recordings also reveal something that has remained one of metal's most persistent mysteries. Cowboys from Hell, as released, contains 10 tracks and runs for 57 minutes. But the studio sessions produced 17 completed songs. 7 tracks were recorded, mixed, and mastered, but never made it to the final album. The question that has haunted Pantera collectors for 3 decades is simple. Why? And the answer, preserved in Terry Date's secret archive, is more complex than anyone suspected. 3 of those 7 songs were cut for length. Atco Records wanted an album that fit comfortably on a single vinyl pressing, and including all 17 tracks would have required a double album, which the label deemed too risky for a band's major label debut. But the other 4 songs were removed for a different reason, one that Terry Date's recordings make explicitly clear. On August 15th, during the final mixing sessions, the band gathered in the control room to sequence the album. They had the 17 completed tracks printed out on index cards, spread across the mixing console, and they were physically arranging them in order, trying different sequences to find the right flow. Dimebag picked up one of the cards, a song called "The Will to Survive," and studied it for a long moment. Then he said, according to Date's recording, "This doesn't belong here. This is too much." Phil asked what he meant, and Dimebag's explanation reveals his thinking about the album's identity. "If we put this on the record, people are going to think we're just trying to be the heaviest band. But that's not the point. The point is to show that heavy music can have dynamics, can have melody, can have fucking intelligence. This song, it's just punishment for punishment's sake. It's impressive, but it's empty." Vinnie Paul agreed immediately. Rex took longer to come around, but eventually he nodded. And just like that, "The Will to Survive," a track that had taken 6 days to record and featured some of Dimebag's most technically demanding guitar work, was cut from Cowboys from Hell. The same fate befell 3 other songs: No Tolerance, Power Struggle, and Blood Oath. Each was removed not because of quality issues or time constraints, but because the band collectively decided they didn't serve the album's larger purpose. Terry Date's notes from those sequencing sessions contain a fascinating observation about how Pantera was choosing songs that showcased range over songs that showcased brutality. It was counterintuitive, and it was brilliant. Those 4 lost tracks remain in Terry Date's personal archive, and according to sources close to the Vinnie Paul estate, they may eventually see release. But hearing them now, decades later, confirms Dimebag's instinct. They're powerful songs, but they would have made Cowboys from Hell a different, lesser album. The most valuable aspect of Terry Date's secret recordings isn't the documentation of conflict or crisis. It's the insight they provide into how Dimebag Darrell thought about music, about tone, about the relationship between technical precision and emotional expression. In multiple recordings from late-night isolation sessions, you can hear Dimebag talking through his creative process, working out problems in real time. One recording, from August 9th during the tracking of Domination, captures him explaining his approach to the guitar solo. Most guitar players, they think about notes, What notes am I going to play? What scale am I using? What's the theory behind it? But that's backwards. You got to think about the feeling first. What emotion am I trying to create? Once you know that, the notes just appear. You're not choosing them. They're choosing themselves. This philosophy, preserved in Terry Date's archive, contradicts the common perception of Dimebag as primarily a technical player, someone whose value was his speed and precision. The recordings reveal a musician deeply concerned with emotional communication, who saw technique as a tool for expression rather than an end in itself. In another recording, this one from the Cemetery Gates sessions that caused so much conflict, Dimebag explains why he kept redoing takes that everyone else thought were perfect. When I play that final sustained note, I need to hear pain in it. Not just vibrato, not just technique, actual pain. And if I don't hear it, if all I hear is a guitar player doing vibrato, then I failed. The listener might not consciously know the difference, but they'll feel it. They always feel it. Cowboys from Hell was released on July 24, 1990, nearly a full year after the sessions began. The first pressing was 25,000 copies, a modest run for a major label debut, and Atco Records' marketing budget was equally conservative. But something unexpected happened. Metal fans, hungry for something heavier than the glam bands still dominating, MTV and more musical than the thrash bands who'd begun repeating themselves, found Cowboys from Hell and spread the word organically. By October, the album had sold over 75,000 copies without any radio airplay or mainstream media support. Dimebag's guitar tone, that scooped mid-aggression he'd agonized over in those late-night isolation sessions, became instantly recognizable. Phil's vocals, switching between melodic singing and brutal screaming, gave other bands permission to explore dynamic range. And Vinnie Paul's drum production, so clear and powerful that every double bass hit registered like a physical impact, set a new standard for metal percussion. Terry Date's private recordings from the weeks following the album's release capture his astonishment at the response. The argument over whether Phil should sing clean or scream on the opening verse of Cemetery Gates had gone on for 3 days. They almost quit over it. And now that verse was the part everyone was talking about. The dramatic shift from melody to aggression was what made the song work. Darrell was right to push back, and Phil was right to insist on his vision, and somehow they found a way to honor both instincts. That was the real magic of Cowboys from Hell. It wasn't compromise, it was synthesis. But the album's success also validated Dimebag's most extreme behaviors during the sessions. The 47 takes of the Cemetery Gates solo, the obsessive tone chasing, the willingness to walk away from the entire project rather than accept imperfection, all of it seemed justified by the results. And that validation would shape how Dimebag approached every subsequent album. The isolation sessions, the perfectionist demands, the emotional intensity, they all became part of Pantera's creative process, for better and worse. The tapes sit in Terry Date's personal archive, rarely heard, their existence known to only a handful of people. They represent a time capsule of creativity under extreme pressure, a document of how great art sometimes requires pushing everyone involved to their absolute limits. And they confirm what Cowboys from Hell proved to millions of listeners, that Dimebag Darrell wasn't just a guitar player. He was an artist with a singular vision, willing to sacrifice anything to realize it. The world got to hear the result when Cowboys from Hell was released in July 1990, but only Terry Date's recordings captured the struggle behind that result. The human cost of transforming metal music forever.